All right. We are officially live here. We're going to give folks a minute or two to kind of filter in. I see people starting to hop in right now. So we've got a big crowd today. A lot to talk about, Michael, from spring weather planting season to very interesting setup for severe weather as we work over the next several weeks and even the next couple of months. And so a big webinar, I think probably from a weather standpoint, one of the more impactful ones that we've done in some time
Mhm.
on numerous different angles. And so excited to be able to chat about that and hopefully answer some questions for you all at the end. We'll try to take as many questions as we can at the end of the webinar. I am going to go ahead and launch this poll for those
Okay.
of you that could be interested in a free trial of Clarity Pro, which is specifically for businesses, operations, organizations. Michael, why don't you, as we start here, who is Clarity Pro for exactly?
Yeah, I mean, with a season like this one and how much it's going to be, how important it's going to be, how dry we are, how active it could be, there could be a lot of weather-related impacts. And folks that are impacted by weather. I mean, whether it impacts your operation, your business decisions, your the way you're farming, whatever the case may be, if weather's impacting time and money and resources, and you need someone to make those decisions for you or to help you, that's exactly who this is for. Um, the trial is a great way to look at what we have to offer, and it doesn't hold your feet to the fire on anything. You just get to try it out. Um, yeah, guys, again, on behalf of myself and Brett, welcome to the growing planting season webinar. Record attendance, record registration for this one. This is a big one. There's a lot of you here, and I'm excited to get going on it.
Yep, let's get right into it. We always kind of start out with how we did last year. And I'm super thrilled with how we did last year. It was a complicated season. You had anything from coming from a strong El Nino into a La Nina. You had hurricane activity, especially Hurricane Helene, that impacted things across the southeastern part of the country. But all things considered, really, really happy with how things evolved versus the forecast and how our team did throughout the season. One thing that we always do is produce an analog package and a forecast for yields from a weather perspective.
Mhm.
Obviously, there's some other things that can go into that, but from a weather perspective, we always try to give an idea, and we were within a point for both, or I should say, what is it, a bushel per acre, whatever the case may be. There, we were within one for the corn and the soybean forecast for 2024. And you can see those areas in blue on the maps in the top left showing above normal yields in those states where we had forecasted higher than normal rain chances, and then areas further south and east that were closer to normal to below normal rain chances, averaging out lower than normal. Again, parts of the southeast impacted by Helene that had a big impact in lowering the yields across the Carolinas and into Georgia as well.
Yeah, and one thing you look at when you look at a lot of those swing states, if you will, and I like to call them the states that still produce towards the yield but aren't the main ones, those dark red states in the east, you can absolutely bet those are from Helene. I mean, that's they did a number on it, big time, and it certainly put a major impact on things for sure. Minnesota, you were below because of flooding rains earlier in the summer.
Mhm.
Um, Indiana, Kentucky, Ohio. Parts of Southern Ohio had a historic drought last year, some of the driest growing season conditions that part of the state's ever seen. So, you know, we're always under the belief, the assumption when these organizations start rolling out 184, 185 yields, monster crops, and guys, what these people are doing is they're taking seasonal weather models and projecting best case scenario. And it happens every year. I see these guys going, "Oh, it's going to be the biggest one yet," and nah, it ain't going to be the biggest one yet this year either. And we're going to talk about that because weather drives this stuff, and that's just the way that
Mhm.
it is. So let's get into it.
Yeah, for sure. One other note on last year, just real quick, and one thing that we're going to get into in this particular year as well is the severe weather risk, because obviously that can have an impact on things as well, both from a safety standpoint for organizations and schools and operations, but also from a yield perspective and flattening corn. These derechos, we've had numerous derechos over the past 5 years, and we had another one roll through right in the area that we had kind of forecasted last year. We're going to give you an update on what this could look like as we get into this spring and this summer from a severe weather perspective as well. But I want to kind of start here, Michael, to set the stage for, I think, what could be one of the more impactful things that we'll talk about, and that's the drought and the dryness that's set up, really dating back to late last fall across the north central part of the country. We've seen improvements. You mentioned Ohio earlier. The lower Ohio Valley, that's been where the storm track is this winter. We've
Hmm.
seen improvements there, but in the time of the year where normally we're going to be getting a replenishing of moisture, that has not really happened across the north central part of the country. There hasn't been a lot of snow, and we're off to one of those driest starts on record for parts of the upper Midwest.
Yeah, I mean, you can even see in the last 4 weeks the continuation of the dryness. It just hasn't been a lot of moisture. But anytime I see D2, D3 level droughts in February,
Mhm.
January, February, I definitely get concerned. Getting moisture up into that part of the country this time of year just isn't really a thing. It's not really normal. Normally, that's a later into the year type thing, as the jet stream reorients and restructures. But you can, Brett, if you would draw an oval shaped from California to the Dakotas, down into Texas, I want you to kind of this here, that is a product of the cold Southwest Pacific waters there off the coast. The jet stream has not been funneling in moisture to this area, and it's responsible for the expansion of this drought and the extremity of the drought. And we need to see that body of warm water start to warm up to transport moisture into these areas. And unfortunately, that's not what we're seeing right now, which is kind of why you're seeing, what you're seeing. And when you go back, I know you've got a slide that looks at the last 3 years. It's rather interesting, this type of thing the last 3 years.
Yeah, and I think it goes exactly back to what you just mentioned, which is the waters off the west coast of the United States, North America, Mexico in general. It's been colder than normal, really, I think, since 2020. And it's not a surprise that we've seen these types of patterns reoccur over the past 5 years. Look at this. Last year, we were coming out of an El Nino, so it's a little bit different. But 2021, 2022, 2023, all three of these years came out of La Ninas like this year. And look at the orientation of the drought right around this time of the year. All of these years, kind of across the central and western part of the country, had similarities to this year with the drought conditions. And where we are right now, it does have an impact on where we can go as we go through spring and into summer. And so we want to keep these years in mind. If you felt some similarities in terms of temperatures and moisture heading into the growing season in these 3 years, I would expect some similarities as we go through 2025 as well. And to be completely honest, Michael, some of these areas have seen this 3, 4, 5 years in a row, just never really been able to fully recover the soil moisture across a
Mhm.
lot of these regions.
Yep. Yeah, and I mean, you look at where we've started in terms of the ranks for the dryness in the next slide. You're running, in terms of since 1893, 133 years. The higher the number, the drier the start of the year. This is from the first of the year to now. So that area that Brett has circled roughly is off to about the top fifth, top
Mhm.
fourth driest start since 1893. And you're factoring in all the majors, 88, 12, 30s, all these years that had significantly horrible droughts. You're factoring those into this. You're telling me right now, north central Iowa and and southern Minnesota, there is more corn grown in that area than anywhere in the world,
Yeah.
and they are the driest start historically almost in 133 years. Even through portions of Illinois into northwestern Indiana, this is a big deal. This is a very, very big deal, and um, we're going to need to see some changes here. I think east we can see them, but west I'm concerned.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think East is probably, if you're concerned in Illinois and Indiana, I see some good signs for you. Further to the west, it's a little bit more hit or miss. It's a little bit more up in the air. And again, we're going to get into that with the spring forecast. And let's start here. We're already seeing some of these areas trend warmer in the short term. Here's just a look at the next 2 weeks. Central and western part of the country going to be warmer than normal. Northern Plains, Canadian Prairies, 10 to 15 degrees warmer than normal. Talk about a difference from last week. Last week, these areas were 30 degrees below normal. This week, we're 10 to 15 degrees above normal. And I do think that some of that volatility will be a theme as we go into the start of spring. Obviously, that's natural in spring, but I think even a little bit more so this year. And I think a lot of that initially starts in the eastern part of the country. You can see we go into the week 2 time frame into the second week of March, and the eastern third of the US is seasonable, let's just say. But there's a little bit more to that story. If we take a look at just all the ups and downs we're going to see, a warm up, a cold shot, another warm up, another cold shot, another warm up, it's very, very up and down over the next 2 weeks. I would say transient is a good way to say that. Central part of the country, warmer than normal. Eastern third of the country, though, a lot of ups and downs and a lot of wild swings as we start out the month of spring. And when we get wild swings like that, you're going to start to get an uptick in precipitation and probably severe weather threats as well.
Yep. Yep. And it's this roller coaster ride of emotions for people,
Yeah,
and that's where we start to get into the potential talk about delays in planting in the east and the lack of rain in the west. You look at the uptick in precipitation week 2, the percent of normal forecast, that's about 150% of the normal rainfall. Which in March, by the way, is a lot
it
because
is.
March averages 4 to 5 inches of rain. Um, but you can see the continued dryness week 1 on the left, week 2 in the central U.S. of concerns there of really replenishing any soil moisture, and even into the week 3 and 4 time frame. I have concerns of this kind of continuing, which
Hmm.
is shown here in the 16 to 30 day outlook. Um, you can see the warmth in the east, the cool in the west, and that creates that gradient where you're going to have a lot of rain, especially in the Ohio Valley, as noted there, the much above normal rainfall forecast. The area I would be concerned about this being too wet is obviously the driest parts, right in through there. I think is, could persistence and the orientation of the jet stream play against this? The answer is absolutely it could, and you
Yeah.
may end up lower in rain there, perhaps.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, for sure. If you just looked at the temperature map, you'd think, okay, this is a great opportunity for rain, but you have to factor in the persistence, just the nature of the pattern, and the fact that we do have a little bit of a split jet stream, kind of a northern jet stream and a southern jet stream here. It's these areas in between that it's boom or bust. If the storms can phase a little bit faster, it's going to be great news, but I think the concern with just how things have gone so far is that it won't do that, as you mentioned, Michael.
Yep.
So,
So,
yeah, go ahead.
um, well, there are a lot of people are still kind of joining in, and if you guys are joining in, excuse me, we've kind of covered what we've seen in the past, over the past year, what we saw last year, and the below trend yields, the growing season problems, the severe weather, and now we're talking about how dry it's been. And we're shifting into now a pattern that could have a lot of severe weather in the east, which are the maps that you see here, for the potential I think Brett even said he was going to go out on a limb and talk about record tornado reports in the month of March.
Yeah, so I'm starting to see a lot of similarities as we get into mid to late March with the upper level pattern to the top 5 years on record in terms of tornado reports in the United States. And I think those years, if I'm remembering correctly, 2023, 2022, we've already talked about some similarities to those years. 2017 is another one, '07, and I believe it was all the way back in 1976. 76 was super active in March, 74 was super active in I believe it was April, that big super outbreak across the eastern part of the country. And you can see here, guys, we're already looking at a severe weather threat in the forecast this time next week. And then if we look in the extended range, and we have a lot of pattern drivers to support this, the CFS forecast here, guys, is already starting to show a big uptick in activity here across the eastern plains and into the deep South Tennessee Valley and into the Ohio Valley. And so this is a big signal here, guys. And again, I do think that it's on the table. This could be one of the more active Marches in terms of severe weather on record.
Yep, for sure. Brett, the next slide when we is more of a seasonal signal, and you were talk about this and the next one as you were kind of talking about. Um, did you change that?
Did I change this? This one?
Yeah, my slide has the pentads of the equatorial depth, and this is the
Oh, that is because,
aha. Okay, so
yes,
talk about this. Sorry.
sneaky animation. Well, let me
Uh-huh.
go back to this first.
Yep.
So we've been in a La Nina. It was a late developing La Nina. It didn't really pick up until, to be honest, late January and into February of this year. We're starting to see some warmer waters in the eastern equatorial Pacific, but if we take a look at the subsurface waters right now, we still have a lot of colder than normal waters below the surface. I think it's going to be very difficult to get out of this La Nina pattern, which is ultimately helping drive the uptick in severe weather. Traditionally speaking, severe weather activity is a lot more frequent following and in La Ninas than El Ninos. That actually changed a little bit as we worked into late last spring. As we went from an El Nino and into a La Nina, we started to see that activity pick up. This year, I think that as we linger La Nina, we can just stay very active throughout the season. And even though the sea surface temperatures at the surface are warming a little bit, the atmosphere, that MEI value that you see down here, that's still in a weak to moderate La Nina state. And I think La Nina will continue to be a big pattern driver as we go throughout this spring. Now, on its own, staying in a La Nina is actually a little bit of a cooler risk and a wetter one. It's a wetter one, especially east. But I do think that, as you alluded to earlier, Michael, we have to factor in the North Pacific Ocean as well. The North Pacific Ocean will really drive the jet stream. It's been a strong, consistent pattern driver over the past 5 years. And here's a look at ultimately what that influence is. And you can see some of the colder than normal waters off the west coast of the United States and especially off the southwest coast of Mexico. This is where our subtropical jet stream moves through. And if you think about the jet stream, when it can pick up more moisture, it can transport more moisture into the United States. But with colder than normal waters, it's more difficult to pick up moisture and transport it into the United States, which ultimately leads to some of those drier signals across the central and southwestern United States. It
Mhm.
also tends to favor more of that southeast United States ridge and warmth, which can lead to the active pattern in the eastern ag belt and maybe a little bit of a warmer pattern as well. And here's what those years look like, years that had a similar Pacific Ocean state in the North Pacific specifically. That was hard to say, North Pacific specifically. You can see here it favors warmer than normal temperatures east, colder than normal temperatures west, and it tends to favor an active pattern here across the eastern ag belt and really down through the deep south. But look at the dryness, Michael. Look at the dryness across the western half of the country and into parts of the western plains, especially,
Yep.
hinting at that signal that we've seen in the drought conditions throughout the months of spring.
Yeah, and really, I mean, when you look at all this stuff, everything's saying this: tropical forcing, oceanic analogs. This really isn't even the models. This really isn't right now a mystery on where this is going to set up and where the problems are going to occur. And if you go to the next slide, the top ocean analogs continue to see the dryness in the central plains there. Um, the wet in the east and the gradient where things are. Top years in here we're looking at 13, 12, 11, 08, 2000. And those years featured problems. Those are some problem years.
They did, and you know what else they featured, Michael? They featured a lot of severe weather. 2008,
Yep.
2011, 2012, 1974.
Yep.
All of these here were some of the most active severe weather seasons on record as we went through spring. 2011 and 1974 both having super outbreaks across parts of the eastern and south central United States in the month of April.
Yeah, I mean 11, 12, and 13 were all. were all poor years for growing. Obviously, 12 was. We know that. And I don't think anyone's calling for a repeat of that. But those 3 years in general were not good years for agriculture. And a lot of that was because of the weather. So, unfortunately, we think there's going to be less than ideal conditions. If you go to the next slide, and I was talking about, these are the ocean analogs looking at ocean patterns. We also look at tropical forcing and kind of tells us where's the primary focus of upward motion, thunderstorm activity, where's the primary focus of sinking air, downward motion, area of high pressure. And we look at years that can um, analog this, that looks similar to this. What years have similar setups where primarily the tropical forcing was over the Western Pacific, and kind of hung out there. So you look at that on the next slide where we have tropical forcing plotted, and you can see that. Brett, talk a little bit about how you came up with these years.
Yeah, so these are years that had a lot of thunderstorm activity, as you alluded to, kind of in the maritime continent, in the Indian Ocean. A lot of La Nina years in here, and a lot of familiar years 2022, 21 again, 2017, and 2011. I feel like 21 and 2011, maybe even 22 to an extent, are years that have shown up a lot in these analogs that we've been looking at. What I really like about these is I think number one, it highlights some of the variability. Look at the central part of the country. We're probably going to have a lot of ups and whoops. Let me go back here. Probably a lot of ups and downs here. Uh, but in general, it shows that type of idea of more warm ups east, more colder air north and west, and a very active pattern in the middle across the lower Ohio Valley, into parts of the Great Lakes, the Northeast, and maybe the far southeast plains as well, Missouri, Arkansas, eastern Kansas, eastern Oklahoma, and then down into the Tennessee Valley. I would say, Michael, with this type of a look, the much above normal precip that this is showing here, again, probably maybe a little bit of a severe weather signal, a more muted signal in the plains, but I do think that something we have to factor in, again, are the current drought conditions. You add that on top of what these analogs are, it probably leans a little bit drier than what these tropical forcing analogs would indicate. And then what we do here, Michael, is blend them all together. We look at the Pacific Ocean, we look at the overall ocean temperatures, we look at La Nina, we look at tropical forcing, we put it all together in one map, and we come up with our top analogs. And 21, 2013, 11, 09, 06, and 01, top six analogs. What's your takeaway from these years for spring, Michael?
Well, severe weather. I mean, heavy rain, plant delays, less than ideal conditions. You know, '01 was a trend line yield. '06 was slightly above. Um, 2009 was decent. It was okay. Um, but these years scream issues for um, severe weather, especially 11, 13, and 21. Those are years that I have concerns with, and having big pattern differences, which if you go to the next slide, the precip takeaway to this is, again, I could see the third bullet point being skeptical that the drought areas see drastic improvement with rainfall. Um, Again, can they? Sure. I'm not saying they won't. I'm just saying I'm nervous about that being possible. Um, I think it's possible that could be a year where the western half of the growing region is not good and the eastern half is good to maybe too wet at times, maybe. And because we can't rule out some summertime thunderstorm cluster risks in the east as well. If we start to see central U.S. dryness and ridging late spring into summer, and we get a ridge in the central plains, you're going to have ridge riding thunderstorm clusters go over the top of that into the east,
Hmm.
which we'll talk about in a second. But
Yeah.
I see the tale of two worlds really right now.
Yep. I completely agree. And we can see it on the model data too. This is
Mhm.
the NMME model. It shows nearly an identical solution for precipitation. Now, these models to the right with temperatures, they tend to be a little bit warm biased in general, but you can see the tendency for the east to be a little bit warmer, maybe south as well, which ultimately again leads to that active pattern in the eastern ag belt, drier conditions right where the drought is. And the EPS seasonal model, same thing, almost identical, I would say. I would say that at this point, and especially in terms of precip, uh, one of the most consistent signals that I've seen on model data at this distance as we go into spring and into summer. It's not often that you get a whole bunch of agreement here between model data at this distance, especially from a seasonal time scale.
Yep. And it's been that way for a couple months. That forecast has been rather consistent.
Yep, for sure. And I do think just to kind of highlight this before we unveil the official forecast, is that it's going to be critical to keep up with the trends. Knowing when timely rains are going to happen for the Western Belt, knowing when you can actually get out in the fields and plant, given how active it's going to be in the Eastern Ag Belt, is going to be critical. And the way to do that is through the Clarity platform. 24/7 chat with our meteorologist as an option. The expert insights. I know the team already putting out insights for severe weather next week, I believe, on the platform. And I know that they were just issuing nowcasts right before we hopped on for storms rolling through the Ohio Valley right now. And so just having that down to the minute detail so you know exactly when to plan with those expert insights is going to be critical. And of course, the long range outlooks, which is really what we're highlighting here today, very, very important. So I would love to be able to help you all out. You can get a free trial for your operation, for your business. Scan the QR code or go to bamwx.com/get started. And here's a couple of the more ag specific features because I know, Mike, we have a lot of people that are farmers that are in the agriculture industry that are watching this webinar today. And so, from spray forecast to GDUs to observed rainfall that you can track for all of your fields, Clarity pretty much has it all.
Yep, yep. When we built it, we wanted it all in one. Consolidate, make it better, newer technology, faster, easy to read. There's nothing like it. It's the best, plain and simple. And we're pretty confident in that. So sign up,
Absolutely.
try it out, try it out. Official spring outlook. There's the AOC. I came up with that term a few years ago. The AOC, that's the area of concern. That's the area we're going to continue to watch. You could argue it might even need to be a little further west, albeit that's kind of out of the ag belt, but nonetheless, there could be potential expansion of dryness there. Very wet in the Ohio Valley, very wet, dry down there in the south and the deep south, and just the general gradient of warm east and cool west, and that's the outlook for spring.
Yep. And again, I do think one thing we haven't touched on a lot is the lower Ohio Valley in terms of the flooding that's already happened there. Kentucky, southern Indiana, I know the Ohio River has been flooding. And again, I am concerned about those areas being too wet. So, as we've mentioned, just a tale of two stories here with the western belt being too dry. And again, if there's a risk to this forecast, it's just that orange circled area trending a little bit drier, maybe much drier in some cases, versus what the analogs, what the data would show right now. And so that's the area to monitor going through this season.
Mhm.
And you could see month by month, guys, the general theme. Kind of the split jet stream northern tier of the US should be decent for the Canadian prairies as well in terms of moisture and then very active across the eastern ag belt, less active the further south and west that you go. I do think that we start to see more concerns grow into May. I don't think it's necessarily a super hot month, but I think the dryness starts to expand. We slowly start to get into that summer pattern that we'll talk about here in a second, and the dryness expands. And as we naturally warm up that time of the year, the drought concerns will get worse. And I think that if we don't get any help in May or in April and March, then we're going to have big issues as we get into May and June.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. Well, key impacts. So we've kind of beaten that into the ground, but want to make sure you're aware of the active severe weather potential, the tornado potential. It's going to have an impact on things. But we're pretty confident that the tornado season might be a busy one. So keep that in mind. The general theme of where severe weather occurs this year looks to probably be further east than normal, and we've kind of seen that shift the last several years, anyways. Um, yeah, so the Dixie Alley, Tennessee, Ohio River Valley down there, probably an active severe weather season for sure. But I tell you what I'm most curious about, Brett, I know a lot of people are frost and freeze threats.
Hmm.
What's that? Talk about that.
Yeah, so I do think something, while the forecast isn't necessarily super cold, we're not forecasting a 2018 right now that's just ridiculously cold as we go into April. But I do think the volatility leads to a lot of ups and downs in the pattern. It's not going to be consistently cold or consistently warm. And a lot of these years that we talked about, 2021 is a great example, had late frost and freeze, even amid what was a warmer start to the season. And so, I think that last 32-degree freeze across the central part of the country, and especially for maybe some of those drier areas as well, when you get dry soils, it's easier for those temperatures to drop colder at night. And so Nebraska, Iowa, parts of Kansas, Missouri, I think we could be a couple of weeks later than normal for that last freeze. And the last frost as well, maybe a little bit later than normal. Although I do think that we're actually maybe even a little earlier than normal across the far northern parts of the country because as we get into May, those areas do start to warm up above normal. And just naturally, those areas are a little bit later as it is. And so as we warm up, I don't think it's as late there, but it could be a later than normal frost and freeze for a lot of areas across the central part of the country.
One thing that kind of tells me where there's going to be a wild spring is the SOI fluctuations.
Hmm.
The differences in pressure between Tahiti and Darwin. And I just look at some of the values on my screen, minus 12 plus 12, minus 12 plus. I mean, I see these fluctuations. I even see plus 32, minus 12,
Yeah.
plus minus 16, plus 11. And so, long story made short, this to me, these are indications of big fronts coming through the area. And with the way the winter has gone, I absolutely think you need to be concerned about late last freezing risks for sure.
Yeah.
So,
Absolutely. That's a
yeah.
great point. Let's get into real quick. Now that we've talked all about spring, let's talk a little bit about summer and specifically kind of starting in May through August. We looked at some of those drought analogs, again, 21 through 23, very similar to this year. A couple of other years, while not necessarily great for temperatures or El Nino and La Nina states, they are similar with the drought conditions right now. And years that were similar to this year and rolling them forward in terms of drought conditions tended to stay dry as we worked into the warm season. This is a pretty decent signal for drier than normal conditions based off of the drought analogs across a good part of the main growing region. A lot of
Mhm.
corn in these areas, Michael, from Minnesota to Iowa to Nebraska there.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's just the area of concern. It's just, not a scare tactic or trying to freak anybody out, but it's just, the signals right now are not ideal. And they're kind of overwhelming at the moment. I mean, there's a lot of decent evidence to that. So, um, we will take your questions. We will talk about if you guys have questions here about this and where some of the methodology, the thinking's coming from. We'll take them at the end. So, be sure to toss them in the Q&A section of
Mhm.
the webinar, and we'll get to them. So, but yeah, years like '03 and '04. You know, '03 was a below trend yield. '04 was or '03 was trend line. '04 was okay. 21 and 22, those were at or below, and so was 23. And it's no surprise because I think you may have a slide next, possibly of climatology the last several years. That's not the next one yet, is
Yeah,
it?
we'll get to that one in a
Okay.
second. I wanted to
Yep.
highlight how similar that some of the early data is to these analogs in
Yep.
terms of precip real quick.
Yep.
This is the EPS seasonal. We'll run through these pretty quickly so we can get to the next part. This is pretty crazy of a signal at this distance from the NMME model from a hot and dry perspective across the plains, but orientation wise, very similar to those analogs. And the same thing here with the multi-model ensemble, the IRI model. Look at where it's dry. All of these at this distance, again, guys, that's really, really good agreement with the dry signal across the central part of the country. And it's very similar to the last 5 years. And we've highlighted the similarities with La Nina, with the Pacific Ocean to this year. And so it's not surprising that recent climatology is something that we need to look at. And in general, it's been drier than normal across the central part of the country and further off to the east. It's wetter as we get into June, July, and August.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at it, listen, 5 of the last 6 years for yields have been below trend. Okay. It hasn't been a thing to be above trend yield. And you look at this map with precipitation, and it tells you exactly why that it is. It's been warmer and it's been drier generally.
Hmm.
And it's been wetter in the east generally. But that has not been the recipe to create monster crops. These 185, yields that have never been accomplished before with a signal like this year, don't bank on it being accomplished this year either. It just doesn't, unless all of this is totally wrong and it all changes. Um, the odds of that happening right now are not very high, I don't think. So we'll
Yeah,
see.
we would need to go into an El Nino. I think that's the only way
Yep.
around it, is
Yep.
we would need to see an El Nino start to develop. And from a historical standpoint, with similar years in the stratosphere to this year,
Yep.
and it's what we call the QBO, and with first year La Ninas, historically, those years stay in a La Nina or stay cool neutral going all the way into the next winter. Wouldn't shock me if we see another La Nina next winter or at least another cool neutral state going into 25, 26. So I think it's unlikely right now. And especially given how consistent data and analogs are, you take a look at our overall June, July, and August analogs right now as a very kind of initial idea for summer. There it
Mhm.
is. I mean,
Yeah.
it looks just like the data. It's drier than normal. Look at the bullseye in central Iowa. I feel like we've seen that a bunch lately
Yeah.
with the drier concerns and hot across the central part of the country, but not as bad further east, not
Mm.
as hot, and not as dry, which may help things from a maybe a soybean standpoint a little bit versus corn.
Yep. Yep, for sure. And again, looking at those, years 11, 13, and 21, all presented their fair share of issues. 21 was actually a tad bit above trend on the yield. It was the only year out of the last 6 years that was, by the way. Um, but 11, 12, and 13 again is kind of that era, that little period of time that I'm a little concerned about. So
Hmm.
if you go to the next map, the key weather impacts for the plant, the growing season in general is plant delay risks to the east and drought concerns and dryness to the west. Obviously, we've seen years where everybody planted way late and it was late but it still was fine. Late planting doesn't mean your crops are going to be bad or that you can't make it happen or that it's over. We have proof of that. We've seen many, many late planted springs delayed or replants even. So that's not a major concern. It's just a concern for productivity and time and
Hmm.
resources. But the overall life of the crop, not a huge concern. The drought concern in the West is the big one that I'm worried about. Um, the overall pattern drivers are suggestive that a drought is on the table,
Yeah.
uh, and perhaps a more notable one. So that's the one that I'm
And,
concerned about
and
there.
I think the difference in this year versus a 2021, Michael, is where we're coming from. It's
Yes,
already dry. It's
yes.
been dry. We've had it for several years now. Somebody made the point here. Northwest Iowa saw historic flooding last June, but then it got dry again. We just haven't seen consistent moisture in these areas. And starting out bad and getting worse is not good, and that is different than 2021.
Yeah, Bruce Jones says, hard to believe Northwest Iowa saw historic flooding last June and now historic dryness. What a frustrating swing. Absolutely. I cannot imagine the frustration that you guys would be feeling in those instances. Um, it would it would piss me off beyond belief. So I'm sure that you all are feel the exact same way in that regard. So I hate it for you guys as well. The next slide talks a little bit more about what I was talking about earlier with the key weather impacts on the thunderstorm cluster potentials. Um, we do have the potential to see some thunderstorm clusters over the top and to the east of this. You can kind of see that. Yeah, there's some stuff there in the middle. And sometimes underneath the ridging, you can actually get pulse-like thunderstorms that
Mhm.
this is probably what you're seeing. You get these
Yeah.
intense major heat bubble pop-up storms that can be severe, but the ridge riders across the top there um, have me concerned a little bit. Yeah, yeah, exactly about thunderstorm cluster potential um, and a risk for a derecho or two this summer, further east maybe than what the last couple summers I've seen.
Yeah, I noticed that too. Instead of it being more centered in Iowa, which I guess that's a piece of good news, although it wouldn't necessarily help from a rain perspective. At least it's not going to flatten your corn, maybe as much as it has at times over the past several years. I think Chicago, Northern Indiana, Ohio, I think it was maybe 2016 and 2012 had systems that moved more through this area. I see some similarities in the storm track in terms of derechos being a little bit further north and east this year.
Yep. I just got a message from James Ramsey. James is watching, a longtime supporter, and he said, "Hey, there's a farmer's tale that seems to come true often more than not. Worst are that the worst droughts start in May." Um, we've seen flash droughts like that develop for sure. The issue this year is just how dry it is to start with what we see going forward. That's the big concern. But interesting tidbit there, James. Appreciate that. He also says that it's a great webinar, so we appreciate that. Um, Pete says 1988 started Memorial Weekend. So basically, just stopped raining there in Memorial Weekend. That's interesting. Um, yeah. Um, This is a look, guys, at the trend. Our forecast right now, and I will say, not to pat ourselves on the back or toot horns or anything, but we don't normally miss this. We've really done really well with this over the last several years, um, and for the most part, despite what you might see in July or August, as when January's done and the final yield comes out, we believe it'll be a below trend yield again, making it 6 of the last 7 years being below trend yields, dating back to 2000 and what is that, 19, I think.
Yeah, look
So
at this.
yeah, you can see that there. And the last time we had a similar trend, you look right, circle the other one, Brett, the 11, 12, and 13.
Right in here.
Um, right in there. And then before that, you go back, maybe you don't really have a period like that where you have multiple years, you have big swings,
Yeah.
but maybe the early 2000s or the early 90s, but there's not really a pattern like what we've seen recently. Which makes you wonder, are we nearing the peak of potential? What is the potential? What can we really do? Um, if we had picture perfect everything, yeah, we could hit a 185, but boy, we're really pushing the envelope there in terms of the potential. The soybean is a near trend forecast, slightly below. Again, though, you can kind of see the idea of the below normal pattern there, especially for beans in that 11, 12, 13 era, um, because of a number of things, whether it was dryness or too much rain or too much severe weather there towards the end. So um, it's looking like it's going to be a year where, the demand is going to be a big deal. And that's going to play a big part on everyone's decision-making processes and make sure you're when you're thinking about your marketing plans that you're talking to smart people who are experts and they know what they're doing and they're not just looking for the next monster record. And it's not all sunshine and rainbows. That those are normally things to run away from in this business is things like that. So um, nonetheless, we will take questions if you have them. We're going to leave the QR code up here to scan again for the free trial. We help a lot of growers, guys, a lot, thousands and thousands of growers can text us anytime, long range, short term, 6 hours out, 6 weeks out. They can text us, they can talk to us, and have conversations with us about making decisions on their farm. And a free trial to test this out going into the planting season is the real ticket. So let's start, Brett. What do we want to? We got a lot of questions coming in.
Yeah, so Thomas says it appears Iowa, especially central Iowa, is dry with higher temperatures. I would agree with that. Maybe not so consistently warm in spring, but definitely into summer. Higher than normal fire threat. and an increase in temperatures higher for threat to health. Yeah, definitely something that we'll need to monitor. As we get into summer as well, as it gets a little hotter and drier in the Canadian prairies, could we see some more wildfires this year that causes wildfire smoke and lower air quality? That wouldn't completely shock me. And maybe the West as well, because the West is also very, very dry. Wildfire season out there has started early with record-breaking wildfires across California and Los Angeles area already this winter.
Yeah, and then I've got Chad says, any thoughts on a late March to early April cold risk attributed to dynamic final warming of the stratosphere? Yeah, there's a risk there.
Hmm.
There is a risk of a late season cold shot, which is why we have those late freeze risks certainly in the pipeline there. And then Chuck says, will it be late May before the majority of the crop gets planted in the east? In my opinion, that's probably close to accurate. Would you say, Brett?
Mhm. Yeah, I think that it's as we get into May is when things will start to get very very urgent in terms of people needing to get out into the fields because April and March are so active and it will be difficult to get dry time.
Hmm.
But I think the pattern gets a little bit better in terms of the Eastern Ag Belt into May, a little bit less frequent with the moisture, and so I think that things ramp up early to mid-May, and then yeah, as you alluded to, I think late May is probably a good call for that.
Dustin, thank you. Appreciate the kind words. What's the first indication that you will watch for a drought? Well, the first indication's already here. It's the driest start to a year ever in a lot of
Mhm.
places. And the cool southwest waters there off the southwest US and the Pacific are things that we're concerned about. Charles says, how do you see the weather pattern affecting the projected 95 million acres? Um, you know, I'm going to be honest with you, Charles. Not a question I'm comfortable answering. I don't know. I'm just going to be honest. I'm not really sure about that. Final outcome from a weather standpoint on the overall health of the crop is my concern. Acres planted and stuff. I'm going to defer to someone that has more expertise there than I would. So, what else we got here, Brett?
Let's see here. Somebody asked if we do yield predictions for other crops outside of corn and soybeans. We haven't, but I don't see a reason why we couldn't look at an analog for that. So if there's other crops that people are interested in, we can certainly always take a look. I just don't have any data right in front of me.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see here. We have a deep frost in central Minnesota. What's the chance that we have the frost out before planting in early May? For central Minnesota, it'll be close. I think you're around normal for those areas in terms of a frost because you do warm up a little bit above normal in May. So I would say it's typical there for central Minnesota.
Let's see. Tyler says, are you thinking Ohio and Indiana are going to see more or less tornadoes than last year? I think it could be more this year than last
Hmm.
year, potentially, or an equal amount.
Yeah, last year did end pretty active as we worked into April and May.
Hmm.
I think it's even bigger this year compared to last year. Lower Ohio Valley, Tennessee Valley, kind of in that region there.
Hmm.
Any reason to think the tropics get fired up early again this year? I think it's possible. Traditionally, post La Nina years are normally pretty active in terms of hurricanes.
Let's see. For those of us in Northern Iowa, we had a very dry spring in 24, started flooding in May, leading to planting and replanting issues. Can we avoid that repeat this year? I hope so. Don't know, Paul, but I hope so. Uh, Probably, but it's hard to say. Um, let's do two more, Brett. Someone says, with the good snowfall we had in northeast Kansas, with that help to generate moisture feel like I can't. I
With the
can't.
good snowfall we had in northeast Kansas, will that help to generate moisture? Well, Rodney's saying that the moisture feels pretty good in northeast Kansas. I would agree, and I think you're probably far enough east that you benefit from some of the storm systems this spring. I would say concerns wouldn't really come back until more like summer for you.
Matt, this is a good one. We'll make this the last one we answer. This Matt says, how would conditions have to change in order to allow the dryness and drought in the West to push east later this summer? We'd have to see a pretty big shift in the jet stream patterns and the global wind
Hmm.
patterns, and we'd have to see a global shift in the northern hemisphere, really, which isn't out of the question. But
Yeah.
odds of that are low.
Some of the like 2012 for example, it didn't linger La Nina into summer. It actually decreased it, and so that ridge kind of moved a little bit further east and expanded it. If we stay in La Nina, I think the core of the dryness will want to stay in the plains where it's been.
Yep,
If we can get out of that a little bit faster, believe it or not, as long as we don't go into an El Nino, then it would come further east, if that makes sense.
yep. Guys, amazing questions, tons of them. We can't answer all of them, but we appreciate all of your support, the participation, the registration to the webinar. If you watch the recording, again, we urge you to give Clarity a shot. We would love to work with you and help you this year. It's what we love to do is help people, and we can help you when it pertains to weather. So, thank you for watching, Brett. Thanks for putting on an amazing seminar webinar here, and you all have the best of luck to you, and we'll see you soon.
Yep. Thank you all so much, and best of luck to start out the season.